So I'm going to introduce our next speaker. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Deborah Norris. She's going to be speaking to us about resiliency in military connected families. Dr. Norris is a professor in the Department of Family Studies and Gerontology at Mount St. Vincent University. Welcome today, Dr. Norris.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that introduction, and I really appreciated Kathleen's um, presentation to us as well. Yes, I am truly honored to be part of this Veteran Family Summit. Perhaps, though, I should just check in. Can I be heard and seen? Is everybody able to see me and hear me? I'm just conscious that I'm
Yeah,
less
you're
fluent.
we can hear you, Deborah. You look great.
Okay, thank you, Larissa. You're kind. So yes, I am very honored and grateful to you, Larissa, Polly, Sherry, all of the organizers of this summit, which of course includes the other members of the Atlas team, for your innovation in planning and implementing such what I consider to be a groundbreaking opportunity for military and veteran families. I've also want to express my gratitude to people like Kathleen, and to the many military and veteran family members who have opened up their hearts and minds to me over the course of my research career to date. And full disclosure, I have no personal connection to the military community. I'm not a child of a military member. I am not partnered in the military. I did not serve in the military. I grew up in Halifax, which some of you would know is a pretty significant military town. But other than that, I'm totally from the city street side of things, and which of course intensifies my deep gratitude and honor for the trust and openness over the course of my career to allow me the privilege of hearing what I will describe as those lived experiences, which have meant so much to me. So yes, my research has always started with lived experience, what we call in my world first voice accounts. That when I started my life as a military and veteran family researcher some years back, was really underrepresented in the literature. Throughout all of the studies I've done, and I'm not going to give you the long laundry list of what I have done, but the high points are I focused on deployment and Navy families, balancing parenthood with operational imperatives. A lot of interest right now in my work on adult children. That was a missing cohort, just seeing some of the intergenerational issues. But where I've landed in the last 10 years, 15 years or so, is on the impacts of operational stress, the bidirectional relationship between the military mission and some of the operational stressors that emanate from that, how that impacts the family, but also how the family is integral to supporting a member or veteran who's living with operational stress. Themes which are very prominent in Kathleen's great presentation. So I've been very intent on bringing some of those stories out into the light, the troops, if you will, and honoring them in the way that I've always felt they should be. Integral to my work, and this has become a mantra within the research team that I'm very happy to be part of, is that military and veteran family members warrant attention, support, gratitude in their own right, not just insofar as they support the military member and mission, as important as that is, as again exemplified through Kathleen's very compelling account. Military and veteran family members are, while they may be integral to the military doing its work, they do a lot of work on their own and warrant attention in of themselves. What's also impressed me through all the first voice work I've done or lived experience is the resilience and resiliency of military and veteran family members. That's emerged as a very significant element of my research program and is the focus of what I'm about to share with you today. Okay, so Kathleen talked about her journey. Again, very compelling and moving account. But when we think about any journey, Kathleen's, yours, mine, or military families in general, do you think of the journey as like looking like this? Like we just have traveled through life on a straight road, clear sight lines. We can see what's to the right or to the left. It's a beautiful sunny day, puffy white clouds. I'm sure, like many of you, and when I look at my road of life to date, as rich and rewarding as so many elements of it have been, it certainly has not looked like a straight path forward. Rather, more like this. Twists and turns, you never know what's around the next bend. There's still a lot of beauty and wonder in the world, as evidenced by the blue sky and the landscape here, but there's a lot of uncertainty and lack of awareness about what might lie ahead as we navigate our way through what some of my colleagues, particularly my American colleagues, call the road of life. I'm very grateful to Gary Bowen and his colleague, Dr. Martin. Some of you may recognize the names as very significant military and veteran family researchers in the United States. They've done a lot of work with the US military. And like me, they like to use metaphors. And the metaphor that I found very useful as I think about resilience and the road of life in particular, and how resilience can be the gas in the tank as we make our way through the road. They've published this article back in 2011 that explicates, some of the things that are significant, in my view, to our capacity for resilience and resiliency. So if you look at this diagram, the way forward is characterized as we make our way through life. Perhaps we sometimes will be impeded by the drag from the surface of the road. There may be obstacles, there may be a road crew on our particular paths or road that are fixing it, or, which will hold us up. There may be a lot of traffic. And in Nova Scotia in the springtime, there will be lots of potholes. So that, of course, is a factor to be reckoned with. And then there are guardrails. More about those guardrails later. But where this leads in terms of the conceptualization of resilience is that we're never really clear on what lies beyond the next bend. But the guardrails are pretty significant to what lies beyond the bend. The guardrails, for me, are very integral to my conceptualization of resilience and resiliency. The things that support us, the resources, the attributes, the capacities and competencies that support us as we make our way through our particular roads of life. The guardrails are instrumental in developing and maintaining resiliency, both for individuals and families, and that includes military and veteran families. So here they include formal supports, which act as instruments of socialization, support, and social control, and that may include both military and civilian agencies. But we also know that significant guardrails in many of our lives are those day-to-day informal supports, which include group associations, unit-based support groups, networks of intimate and non-intimate relationships. And formal and informal supports are often reciprocally related. They do not work in isolation. So let's talk about how guardrails can be developed, maintained, kept in good order through and by the practice of resilience. So here's a diagram that illustrates how I conceptualize resilience in my research program, which doesn't come from me. As you can see, I'm giving due credit to my academic friends, which include Bowen and Martin in the US, as well as Joan Patterson, who's done a lot of work on resiliency. At face value, resilience may appear to be a very simple construct. Most of us, when we think about resilience or resiliency, we think of it as a trait that we either have or we don't have. It's something that's baked into our minds, into our temperaments from birth, and that some of us will have more of it and others will have less of it. That's a conceptualization of resilience that has been rethought in recent years, fortunately, because I think what most of us know is that resilience is not necessarily something we have or we don't have. We've either got the right stuff or we don't. But that resilience is a capacity that needs to be nurtured and supported and reinforced throughout the course of our lives. And yes, do we help ourselves by doing what we need to do to make that happen? For sure. But we also know that we need a lot of guardrails. We need a lot of those informal and informal supports, which is why today we now think about resilience and resiliency and actually use both words, which are similar and related, but mean different things, almost simultaneously in the same sentence. We think about, yes, resiliency as an outcome, as the byproduct of being able to operationalize our strengths and abilities and capacities, which in part do come from ourselves, but also from the people and places and things around us, the guardrails that offer us support. But we also know that, and Kathleen's story really underscored this point for me, is that resilience is a process. It's something we engage in and do every day. It's not just a trait or ability. It's not just having the right stuff or not. It's actually something that we have to work on and develop and grow over the course of our lifetimes. So thinking about this has been very significant as I've landed on the notion of family resilience in my research program. So let's look at how I think about family resilience, and I'd be very interested in your input insofar as how this resonates within the military and veteran family community. So here's a definition. Academics love definitions, so here it goes. But I think it will make sense to many of you, because I apply it to my own life and some of the things that I've had to contend with. It makes sense to me outside of what it means to me as a researcher. So it's a path. So there we go. We're thinking about the road of life, a path that a family follows as it adapts and prospers in the face of stress, and that stress can be normative or non-normative. And we all know, and again, Kathleen's story made this very clear to us, that in the military context, there is a considerable amount of non-normative stress, the relocation, the postings, the combat, all of which she highlighted in her talk with us. So those non-normative military-related stresses do call for people to adapt and prosper within the family. And you can have it nailed in the present, but tomorrow or next week or 2 years from now, new things may be thrown at you that you will call for new abilities and adaptation capacities. But the thing about resilient families is that they adapt positively to these conditions in unique ways. But that depends on the context, back to those guardrails again. Also the developmental levels. And things can get a little murky inside the family system when there are, as there often are, particularly in multi-generational families, different developmental imperatives, different developmental tests by virtue of age, the chronology of the different people in the family. We also need to consider the interactive combination of risk and protective factors. So where's the balance there? Certainly there will be risk factors, particularly in the military context, but to what extent are those guardrails operationalized and working to good effect? In other words, what kind of protective factors are at play in the family system? Sometimes too, the family's shared outlook makes a huge difference. And what I have learned, and again, I'm funneling this through a civilian brain and civilian analysis, is that what does help foster family resilience in the military setting is this shared belief that the work that the military member or what the military veteran has done, or what the military member is doing, or the military veteran has done, is important. It's about national security. It's about serving your country. It's being called to put aside your own individual proclivities and needs and desires and put the welfare of other people, your fellow Canadians, if you will, in the Canadian Armed Forces context, put their needs, the needs of the nation, before your own, which of course means by extension that the family has to walk that road and share that perspective as well. So resilience on the family level is exacerbated and maintained. It's a little easier to keep going on that road of life with resilience as the gas in the tank, if you have that shared belief that this is important work, that it is significant on so many levels, and that sometimes the member, veteran, and family to put their, well, not sometimes, often put their own needs and desires in the background rather than the foreground as they do the work that they're called to do. What is important for me as I think about resilience and resiliency, and this hopefully is apparent to you from what I've shared so far, is that resilience or resiliency, remember, resiliency is the outcome and resilience is the process that yields multiple outcomes along the way. That this is not just a function of having the individual capacity to be resilient, that innate ability, but it's also a function of social factors, particularly social support or the guardrails in our lives. It's a combination of both. What I have learned through the privilege of listening to accounts of lived experience with military and veteran families is that resiliency and resilience is indeed not an innate ability, but a byproduct of those social guardrails, the resources, supports that are external to the family system. What I also think about as I make sense and analyze the reams of data that I've collected, fortunately, with many, many interviews and focus groups with military and veteran families over the years, is that family resiliency can be operationalized, or it happens, in other words, through these three practices or processes, which I call the 3 R's, but different 3 R's from what we're typically used to. These 3 R's are resisting, recovering, and very importantly, reconfiguring. So let's look at each. Family resilience and resiliency sometimes involves holding things back, resisting the stresses, the normative and non-normative stresses that challenge the family's capacity for resiliency. So yes, this might involve innate capacities and seeming invulnerability to the stressors. If you've got that innate temperament that predisposes you to be able to do that well, so be it. That's great. What also is involved, though, in family resilience and resiliency is the capacity to recover. And sometimes programs and services of support are focused intently on helping a military member or a veteran or their family members to return to a previous state of well-being after they've encountered or experienced a particular stress, particularly a non-normative stress. But what has impressed me no end in my research life to this point, and I know that this will continue, is the capacity of military and veteran families to not just resist or hold it back, not just go flip back to the way things were before, but to actually reconfigure, which is referred to as the capacity to rebound from adversity with new skills and strengths. And I'm not sure if Kathleen could speak to this directly, but I know in my own first voice opportunities in my research program, I have heard multiple stories of reconfiguration or that bouncing back. So it's not bouncing back, but bouncing forward, because flipping back to recovery for a moment, that's referred to as bouncing back. And when we think about resiliency in other contexts, that's how we normally imagine it, as going back to the way things were. But what I've noticed in the military context is, yes, that happens, but what is also happening is bouncing forward or reconfiguring. And when you hear the stories, it seems almost as if it transpires magically, which in fact is a borrowing. When I think about that, I'm also mindful of a term that's used by Anne Maston, who's a very prolific yes, I guess she looks at individual resilience, but also family resilience. And she doesn't work in the military context, but she refers to resilience and resiliency as ordinary magic, coming from the work of developmental psychologists who were very intent on understanding why individuals who are dealing with extreme and profound stress, such as young children, and I think Maston's work mostly focuses on children, young children who are being parented by individuals who live with alcoholism or substance abuse or undiagnosed and untreated mental health disorders. That seemingly these little people just have this incredible capacity for not just bouncing back, but bouncing forward. So developmental psychologists were very, very intrigued by this and wondering, what is it about these small people that makes them able to do that? Well, it turns out some of them did have that innate capacity, but also they had something in their life that was acting as a guardrail. It could have been a teacher, it could have been a hockey coach, it could have been the neighbor down the street or an aunt or an uncle who all it took was that one person to step in and say and offer that kind of informal support that is so instrumental in developing resilience and resiliency. So it's always intrigued me to what extent the ordinary magic happens within in the military and veteran family context. But is it really magical, or is it actually concerted and work that involves effort? And that's what I contend, is that while there may be, because so much of the work is invisible, we think of it perhaps as ordinary magic, when in essence, as I've broken down the hundreds of interviews that I've done over the years, what I see as I look at those transcripts of interviews and focus groups as intently as academics are trained to do, what I've seen is a lot of work, a lot of effort, a lot of concerted and instrumental action that makes resiliency happen. It may look like ordinary magic, but in essence and in actual fact, it's actually a lot of work that sometimes happens behind the scenes. So what I hope I have accomplished to some extent through my work is rendering this, through my research work, my research studies, is rendering visible that work so that it is out in the open and people can see it and honor it as I believe it should be. So when I thought about, and as I continue to think about resilience and resiliency and as work, of course, what we do as academics is we look to theoretical models. And I promise I'm not going to get all theory geeky on you here, but I will share a snippet of a model that's been very helpful to me, and I think will resonate with all of us, because we all live with these concepts and propositions within our everyday lives. So I'm sure we'll recognize them. So we all know that as we travel that twisty, turny road of life, we are meeting lots of demands, the potholes, the drag on the road, the construction crew that's delaying our progress, etc. So we know that demands then are daily hassles. Sometimes the hassles go away, they're pretty ephemeral and temporal, but sometimes they stick around for a while. They may be chronic, or they may be those bolts from the blue, those acute stressors and conflicts. So we all have those, right? But what we also have, we hope, are the capabilities. And again, thinking of my conceptualization of resiliency, those capabilities may come from our own innate ability, but they also come from those social supports. And what I have pulled out into view for today's presentation are some of the capabilities that I have gleaned from the work that I've done so far that I think are instrumental in developing and maintaining resilience and resiliency. So I'm going to share a little bit of what I've learned in that respect. But first, I'm going to break the demands vis-a-vis capabilities down for you with very brief definitions of each. So as my previous slide noted, demands include those daily hassles or chronic and acute stressors or conflicts that may emanate from normative or non-normative stressors. But here's where things get interesting. these are the capabilities that may buffer or ameliorate the impact of some of those demands, because capabilities are those resources which, in the theory that I'm drawing from, are considered to be what the family has, but also the coping behaviors, which is what the family does. So capabilities are those, is the work, the actions, what people draw from to do the work, to exercise those coping behaviors, which are significant in developing and maintaining resiliency. So let's talk about the demands. And I'm speaking to a group of people I know who are very familiar with the demands and some of the daily hassles and chronic and acute stressors of military and veteran family life. But I will just pull into view a couple of first voice accounts that will speak to the demands that serve as the backdrop for the main event, which is an articulation of the capabilities, which I will get to next. So here's two first voice accounts. Well, last week when I went to his psychologist. This is a partner, a military partner who is supporting her veteran, who is living with operational stress, PTSD in this case. Well, last week when I went to his psychologist appointment, and we were discussing other potential options he should go for, like if there's any other treatment available for him. So trying to work out a treatment plan for her injured veteran family member. And here's another example. I know I am far from being the only one to do this, but when I left my job to be more present for him, I did not work at first, but I had no salary. It was problematic. Sadly, I felt alone trying to lift a mountain. The very compelling quote here, which indicates to us that this particular military partner partnered again to someone living with PTSD, that she felt it necessary to move away from paid employment and focused almost completely on supporting her veteran who's living with the injury of PTSD. So just two examples. But let's move from there to the capabilities. And the capabilities, as I've mentioned before, are instrumental in fostering resilience and resiliency. So remember before when I talked about the 3 R's, well, now I'm going to talk about the 3 M's, because as I've analyzed all my data, and in particular, I'm thinking these data come from a study I did some years ago, courtesy of Veterans Affairs Canada, which gave me and my research team the funding to do this. So due credit to them. But this was a study that did focus on the bidirectional relationship between operational stress and family functioning. And when we looked at the family piece and how families are integral in supporting the veteran who's living with PTSD, which was the most frequent operational stress reported in our study, I was able to isolate or break down the 3 M's, the three capabilities, the three elements of the work that is done by military and veteran family members in response to the compelling need to support their military member or veteran. So here's the first of the 3 M's, monitoring. So remember, capabilities are what families do and what they have. So monitoring is the first of these. I think to kind of get through this, you have to develop some additional skill sets to kind of find your way to help de-escalate, to have better insight, to sometimes just be a little more honest in talking about what's happened. And Kathleen would resonate with that. Like even to say to him, like to be able to say, what's going on? This is a good day. It's a bad day. What happened? Rather than kind of ignoring it and kind of plowing through it. So here's a partner who is speaking to her everyday life, wherein she needs to do a mood check and to check in on what kind of a day this individual, her veteran who is living with PTSD, what that day is going to be like. Because as I'm sure many of you know better than I, so much is dependent upon there's so many external and internal factors that are contingent upon how well a veteran will do with PTSD on any given day. Another example of monitoring, It's just, sometimes it's almost like walking on glass. It's tiptoeing around situations, judging the mood. So back to that mood check piece before advancing a subject or conflict. It's kind of judging the mood first. So a very, very straightforward indication of the significance and the regularity of monitoring. Another monitoring example. This is a partner who's talking about her son. I didn't interview the son, but she's relating what she sees in her son as he monitors. So as she says, my son's a lot more intuitive. He's much more, he picks up on what's going on with everyone. So he'll sometimes come to me, he goes, Dad was really off today. And I'll say, yeah. Or I'll say, this is not a good day, right? And or it's like Dad's really cranky. He'll be like, yeah, this is what happens. So he and I can talk about it. So this woman is fortunate that both she and her son are intent on checking the mood and can support each other as they do that, as they monitor. But there's also a lot of managing. So managing, as I'm sure you figured out, is the second of the 3 M's that pop up from the research that I've done so far. So here's a spouse talking about being the manager of the mental health care that needs to happen because of the injury that her partner has sustained through combat. He would miss a lot of his appointments, or he'd be late, or he didn't write it down. So it took me a long time to convince him and make him write it in his family calendar. So we have iPhones, so we share the calendar together so he can see my appointments, but I can also see his. So I can kind of help him remind, like, oh, did you think of this? For this doctor's appointment, you need blood tests. Did you need blood tests? Did you think about it? Sometimes it's hard because I give reminders and he feels like I mother him. There's been a bit of a struggle to keep the two apart. By the two, I'm pretty sure, if I recall correctly, she was referring to, the distinguishing between her monitoring, which she sometimes calls a mothering, another M here, but also her role as being a partner, being a wife to this man. Shorter, but also very important managing example. Basically, it's just like I try to handle everything so that he doesn't have to deal with it, because the less he has to deal with, the less breakdowns, meltdowns we have. So she sees her managing as the work that's necessary, as she perceives it, to forestall some of the impacts or the symptomatology of the PTSD that her partner lives with. And then there's a third M, and this one's called mobilizing. This is being the linchpin in figuring out what kinds of guardrail supports, both formal and informal, are going to be helpful for her veteran. So here are 2 examples. A lot of the services that were put in place for him were done by either my mother or me. This is an adult daughter speaking here. So we really mobilized everything for him to be able to get back up on his feet, to live a relatively normal life. And here's another account. I know what has to be done. I know where to go to get this. I know where to do that, which is the role of a social worker. So we've gone from, these are different people, but one woman talking about herself as maybe being like a mother, and here's another partner talking about being a social worker, being plugged in to the services and supports, the guardrails in their vicinity that will be supportive of their injured veteran. So to circle back before I invite any questions or comments that you may have, what I hope pops out for you, what I hope emerges from these accounts, and in the interest of time, I've been very selective, but I could pull into view so many more that speak to the work that's involved in developing and maintaining resilience and resiliency. But what I hope is clear is that that capacity, those 3 M's, those capabilities, are a byproduct of, to some extent, individual abilities or traits, but also a lot of social support. I hope you can also see in those snippets evidence of the 3 R's, that the 3 M's lead to the 3 R's, that there's some evidence of resisting, recovering, but very importantly, the reconfiguring. or the bouncing forward. Because this for me has been the most intriguing and compelling finding from some of the work that I've done so far. As we do in my world, I'm putting together kind of a schematic, a model that will show the interdependencies between demands and capabilities and the integral role of resources or guardrails and how that yields the capacity for resilience and resiliency. But where I will end is with some of the implications. And I've just got two here, but probably more will come. More could come to mind as we think about what I've shared with you today. But we'll begin with these two, and that is developing and maintaining resilience and resiliency involves work for military and veteran family members. And what my research has yielded is that work involves the 3 M's of monitoring, managing, and mobilizing. And while innate capacities are significant to the 3 M's, what's also important are the guardrails. And those are family and community resources or capabilities, what families have and what they do. They have the potential to buffer demands and enhance the capacity for resiliency. So that's where I will conclude with my, again, deep gratitude for your interest and attention, and I look forward to any comments or questions. If you would like to reach out to me after the summit, my contact information is here, my email address. I can see where I hang out every day in my academic life, and also there's a link to the website which will direct you to some of the publications that I have put out into the universe so far. So thank you very much.
Dr. Norris, thank you so much for that. I really liked this whole idea of traveling down that road and having guardrails, and I think it just brought up the question for me. Well, what are my guardrails? And both within my family unit and outside. Also, like you referenced lived expertise as first voice experiences. That was really resonated with me. And you're absolutely right. In the military, Army, Navy, Air Force, or Special Forces, the family has to live with this adage of its mission before self. I just thought that was just me, but actually no, it's the family. The family signs on. They sign on the dotted line as well too. They have to adhere to the machinations of military life and put the mission first. So again, thank you so much for your presentation today. And I'd like to pass it over to Larissa and Polly for their comments.
Thank you. And I think we actually have a couple time for a couple of questions, Dr. Norris, if you are so inclined. So interesting that you picked up on the notion of mission before self, Huff, and I don't think that's the words that that you used, Dr. Norris, but just the thought of kind of putting service or the country before kind of the family needs. So that's something that resonated with me well. And I really appreciated you kind of breaking down resilience and resiliency and what it is. So if I can, I'm just going to pose a couple questions. First of all, someone's saying that the presentation was very helpful and that someone recognized their our own family situation, many of your examples. So one was kind of an observation and prompting conversation, which I think is brilliant. That's the whole purpose of this weekend. Someone states, I do not agree that we return of a previous state of well-being. You can be better, but you cannot return at the same place after what you have lived. You are transformed.
Which is why, if I can step in and respond to that, Larissa, which is why when I look at the 3 R's, because that's what we're referring to here, I have what the data have, the first voice accounts have demonstrated to me so clearly that it is the reconfiguration piece that is most prominent. through and by the opportunity to support, to live as part of the military and veteran context, the military context. So yes, I totally agree that bouncing back is not as significant as bouncing forward with new capacities and abilities. I've seen so many examples of that, and I'm sure Polly and Larissa and Kathleen, you have lived that too, and have a whole new list of things that you can now do by virtue of what you have done as a military family member. So I totally agree with that comment.
Great, thank you. And one more question. Dr. Deborah, what would you suggest to Indigenous governments to foster resilience for veterans and their families, keeping in mind specifically that Indigenous people are already having to be resilient in response to intergenerational effects of colonization and past and continued assimilatory practices and policies? So again, I think the question at the beginning was, what would you suggest to Indigenous governments to foster resilience for veterans and their families?
Well, I'm speaking as a as a descendant of white settlers who colonized this continent. So I don't have that standpoint, but how I would imagine that and would look for input from the community, the Indigenous communities in of themselves, is that it's a lot of empathy for what I would see as an intersecting experience where some of the realities of living in a settler culture and how that has affected Indigenous identity and context, and then marrying that to some of the issues and problems that emanate from living in a military context. That forms this matrix that I'm sure, again, coming from my external standpoint, I'm sure that forms a matrix that would add extra complications. So are we doing enough right now? Probably not, but I think I would certainly encourage any funders, and that would include, all the funders that we're very familiar with, those of us who do research, to really look at that issue. I don't think we know a lot about what's best, but as we do, I'm sure there would be an appetite for including those first voice accounts, that people who do live with those intersecting realities. I don't think it would be possible to do it without that, without the involvement of people who actually live with that. So hopefully I've addressed that very profound and concern adequately.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation today. So I will maybe turn it to my colleagues on some of your thoughts and reflections.
I think for me, as Huff said, using that analogy of resources being the guardrails, I love that, Deborah. Every time I see Deborah speak, it's like little nuggets that I can take away. And just as a backdrop, probably Deborah was one of the people that Larissa and I got to see previously, and really fueled this gap and bringing the summit to all of you, because we've heard Deborah speak on several occasions, and the work that she's doing is so important, and just highlighting it and how it's going to change things going forward. And I really I think that the piece that I'm taking away today is really that bouncing forward. I say bounce back a lot, just in our day-to-day life. And my husband still has, or we as a unit have those off days, or we feel like we're on the roller coaster, and then we kind of bounce back. But I love the bouncing forward, because we really never bounce back to the spot we were at. We're always further ahead, and so that reconfiguring piece is never ending, really. And from the point that we reconfigured when we were in the military, adapt and overcome, right? That was the motto. It was like, do what you need to do. So those are the two really great things that I took away today from Deborah's chat.
Thank you, Polly, very much. I appreciate those ringing endorsements. It means a lot. Thank you.
Yeah, I think one of my takeaways is about the capabilities of monitoring, managing, and mobilizing, particularly what Dr. Norris was talking about within the managing component is something that I call kind of caregiving versus supporting. And she referred to the caregiving maybe as like kind of that mothering versus supporting. And I know that's something that I have to be very conscious of. And it's hard because sometimes you feel overbearing, but then sometimes you feel like you're pulling too far back. So I think as a family member, that is certainly a challenge that I have to continually work on, and sometimes tap into some of my guardrails, whether it be peer support or my own clinical support to make sure that I'm staying on the road.
Yeah, I agree as well too, Larissa. It's sometimes it's difficult, I believe, to figure out where you stop and other people start. And sometimes we can get a little bit enmeshed in other people's journeys, and in particular with our partners. But again, a big theme that I'm hearing throughout the couple of days, it needs to start with communication um, at some point. And if I'm having problems with communication, which I have, um, is there a support out there that's going to help me to be able to better communicate? Uh, what is out there? Um, in with the people I used to hang out with, they used to say time spent on reconnaissance is seldom wasted. So the time that I spend looking for, searching for supports, being vulnerable enough to say, you know what, I need some help in this, is it's not time wasted. I'm investing in myself. I'm investing in my family's mental health journey. So very compelling, and very inspirational presentation today from Dr. Norris. We've got some time. If there's any other questions or anything before we head to the break.
Yeah, and I think as we're waiting for folks to type in a couple, we're going to hit the break on time, which is amazing. But a couple of things I wanted to acknowledge is I kind of throughout the last couple of days, and certainly in Dr. Norris's presentation, we use the term PTSD, and I think for Dr. Norris specifically, that is who she studied, was people particularly who had a diagnosis of PTSD. So the reason for that rationale there, and for the rest of us, we're speaking to our experiences, which happen to be a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. But within the work we do at Atlas, and I think even across a lot of the presentations over the last couple of days, a lot of the subject matter can apply to any traumatic injury. Might not necessarily be PTSD or CPTSD or depression or any of those, but the experiences of family members can be similar, regardless of the diagnosis. And again, I know that we've been talking the context or reference points with some of the speakers lately has been combat related. We are acknowledging that not all injuries are sustained just through combat, that there can be domestic operations, there can be experiences of military sexual trauma. So we want to acknowledge that we're kind of, it just happens that we can only speak to our own experiences, or the guests if we've asked, but certainly compassion fatigue can apply to any family member supporting a loved one. And again, acknowledging that when we are talking about veterans, we're talking about Canadian Armed Forces veterans and RCMP veterans and families. So things might not fit exact for you, but as Polly had said, pull what applies to you right now and leave the rest. And we're hoping that in future summits, if we're able to run similar events, we can delve a little bit deeper into some more specific topics in future sessions.
Thanks very much for mentioning that, Larissa. You're absolutely right. It's not all combat related. So we're going to head into the break. This has been a very informative morning. We're now going to take a bit of a respite to give you an opportunity to step away, have a quick walk, refresh your beverage, write all sorts of good comments in the chat about the MC. And yeah, and we're going to take about 15 minutes. So you're zooming in from all over the country and all over the world. So when I say go, it's 15 minutes from the go. And go.